Good afternoon. So we're gonna ease into this panel. You are at the Community Land Trust Affordable Housing Developer Partnerships panel. If anyone needs to take a minute to do some stretching or jumping jacks to stay awake on the last day, the last afternoon of the conference, please do. Any moment during our discussion you want to step to the side and wake yourself up, you are welcome to. And that goes for the panelists also. And I might be doing some jumping jacks myself. Okay, before we get further, we have some impromptu poll questions that we didn't prepare the conference with, but we would love to know, by a show of hands, for those in the room, who works at an affordable housing developer. All right. And who has at least a passing familiarity with community land trusts? All right, lots of hands. And who was at yesterday morning's preservation focus panel? I have the name here, exploring the state's growing role in anti-displacement and preservation efforts. Okay, only a few. That's good, because we have some overlapping panelists. I was going to decide if we needed to introduce them with different names, different identities, but I think we're okay. For full bios and intros of our panelists, I'll ask you to look at the program notes in the app or printed just to save us some time. But I am very fortunate to be here with Roberto, Debbie, Stacy, and Jeremy, and you'll be hearing from all of them in a moment. We are going to be exploring current community land trust and affordable housing developer partnerships, looking at opportunities, challenges posed by these partnerships, and jumping in on some in-depth case studies to bring them alive. I'm going to start with a little overview of what a community land trust is for the few people who didn't have their hands raised before. I'll keep it relatively brief. And then I'll give a high-level overview of how these partnerships are playing out. And then we're going to hand it to Roberto to give us a feeling for the scene in Los Angeles, and then we're going to jump into these two case studies. So that's the plan. Everyone's ready? Let's do it. Okay. First of all, community land trust, we'll use the acronym CLTs a lot. So CLTs are rooted in global traditions of cooperative land ownership. They came together to form the first CLT in rural Georgia in the 1960s, when civil rights workers founded the model to establish black ownership over land and housing in a part of the state where that hadn't been possible due to private and public discriminatory policies. From Georgia, the CLT model spread to cities, and today it's most popular in areas where the affordability crisis is most acute. Right? So most of our groups are turning to this model in response to displacement pressures, particularly in communities of color. So what is a community land trust? Nonprofit 501c3. CLTs have these two pillars that are at the center of what they do. One is community ownership and permanent affordability. And they do that by splitting the land and the improvements of property, mostly housing, but not entirely housing. And they use a 99-year ground lease to achieve that permanent affordability. So here we have a feel for some of the different types of housing that CLTs are putting into action in California today. Many CLTs focus on homeownership. Others use rental housing. And in the homeownership sphere, there's both single-family and multifamily homeownership in the form of condos and co-ops. We have a recording in progress. Many of our CLTs are also looking at non-housing land uses, so urban agriculture, small businesses, a whole range of community facilities. And for those focused on the rental side, might be worth just giving a quick overview of shared equity housing. So our CLTs that focus on homeownership are trying to create homeownership that remains affordable on each resale. So the traditional subsidized homeownership model puts subsidy into a home so that it's affordable to a low-income family on the first purchase. When they resell, it's typically resold at market rate. This is how most down payment assistance programs work. And the challenge here is that the market rate, as it rises, which it does throughout California, it'll become less affordable, right? We know how this goes. Incomes aren't keeping up with property prices. Shared equity housing caps the resale at each time of resale. It caps the home price at each time of resale, I should say, so that it allows for modest wealth building, right? It's allowing through a formula for some amount of appreciation equity for the homeowner, but it's capping that at a level that the home will still resell at a price that's affordable to another low-income family. Another key component of the CLT model is what's called in the CLT world stewardship, and it's some combination of asset management and property management and support services for the low-income residents of CLT properties. On the support services side, CLTs have a whole range of different kinds of programs. Many do foreclosure prevention for homeowners or financial counseling. Many have pooled reserve funds and other supports. And then on the monitoring and enforcement side, there's that 99-year ground lease I mentioned. That's where the affordability restrictions are locked in, whether it's rental housing or home ownership. And the CLT will use that ground lease as well as active engagement with residents and property owners to make sure that those affordability restrictions and use restrictions on the property are enforced throughout the length of the ground lease. And the last key component is CLT center community ownership. And that's typically done by establishing a board that has resident representatives as well as community leaders actively engaged in directing the organization. And this keeps the CLT both on mission in terms of meeting the needs of its residents, but also meeting the broader affordable housing needs of the community. So you can see CLT properties in California take a different range of shapes and forms. We have community land trusts in rural areas, urban areas, and increasingly there's a lot of CLT activity outside of the metro cores of LA and the Bay Area, and in areas that are kind of experiencing the brunt of the affordability crisis. So we have a lot of interest in the Inland Empire, in the Central Valley, in places like Eureka, so not just the kind of core urban areas many of us are coming from. And then you can see pictures. These are community land trust folks from all over, members of the California Community Land Trust Network, which is where I sit as co-director. We provide capacity building support to these groups and also coordinate policy. We're running a couple bills, and if you were at that panel early yesterday, you heard about a number of these bills, and I'll touch on them in a second. So a quick overview of the different shapes that these partnerships between community land trusts and external developers can take, and then we're gonna get into the good stuff with our panelists. So a quick note that some CLTs are developers, some CLTs are sometimes developers, and some never do development themselves and always rely on a partnership. So there's a variety here. My ugly diagram here will clearly illustrate the variety. So in version 1, we have a scenario that we see quite a lot where there's an affordable housing developer that's out in the lead in the pre-development and construction phases and then titles the property over to a CLT who focuses on that long-term stewardship mission. In version 2, again, the developer's out in front through construction, and then particularly with rental properties, sometimes that developer will retain ownership of the building and manage the building as affordable housing while the CLT owns the land, and they're brought together by that ground lease again. And then in the third version, it's quite popular for the CLT to be a co-developer. They're working hand in hand with the developer through development. So why, kind of big picture, why do affordable housing developers and community land trusts partner? What's in it for them? Basically, there are complementary capacities and assets that each are bringing to the table, and in many cases, we're seeing that they fit really nicely together. So CLTs are bringing that focus on stewardship and resident engagement, as well as the deep roots in the local community, which can often be leveraged to advocate for development projects and build long-term relationships with other nonprofits, elected officials, et cetera. And then I should probably ask you what developers do, but in this simplistic model, developers are bringing expertise in project execution. They're bringing balance sheets to help secure financing and relationships with lenders. So the money, the execution, the development experience. And just quickly, I'll note a couple exciting developments that I think are gonna set the table for future CLT developer collaborations. One is the Foreclosure Intervention Housing Preservation Program, FIP. This was passed into law last summer and provides $500 million for acquisition rehab on small buildings at risk of foreclosure, either at risk or in foreclosure. And we're hoping that money will start rolling out by this fall or over the summer. And then there's a similar program, CAP, the Community Anti-Displacement and Preservation Program, that's being considered by the legislature now. That's another $500 million for acquisition and rehab. And like FIP, it provides flexibility that works for CLTs, and that it allows for homeownership conversions over time, right? Rental buildings converting to limited equity co-ops or limited equity condos, and also works with the split ownership model. And those two things are not true for many public funding sources, and so a really exciting possible source for community land trust projects. And then finally, for the reasons I just gave, most tax credit type financing structures don't work well for community land trusts, but both nationally and locally, we're seeing some innovative use of LIHTC in partnership with CLTs, and we're gonna hear about one today. Okay, so with that, I'm gonna hand it to Roberto. We're gonna hear about the many CLT developer partnerships blooming in LA over the last year. And I didn't mention, but we're gonna open things up to questions at the end, so I hope you hold on to those as we go.
Is this mic on? Yes, okay. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Roberto, and I'm with Fideicomiso Comunitario Tierra Libre, which is a community land trust based in East LA and Boyle Heights. And today I'm gonna talk about the organization I work for, but I'm also going to talk about the CLT CDC partnership that we have with Little Tokyo Service Center. But I also, what's really important is that, Fideicomiso is not the only community land trust working in LA County. And so I'll talk about how important it is that we have regional infrastructure where CLTs and CDCs coexist and have been coexisting for some time. And so a great example is Fideicomiso Comunitario Tierra Libre, which was actually incubated at a CDC. So the CDC actually fundraised, worked collaboratively in collaboration with the community and other organizations to spend 2 years incubating a community land trust. The presentation is not about that, but it's like, that's a start. That's like a really clear start of how a CDC could really invest in community land trust work. I don't know why it's in red, but it's okay. The Fideicomiso was started it started in 2017. We were incubated by the East LA Community Corporation, and in 2019, 2020, we became an independent organization. And at that time, the focus pre-pandemic was always about anti-displacement. It was always about putting community control over land and housing and decommodifying housing, specifically because of the mass displacement that we were seeing in the neighborhood. And so for us, that was always a priority. It was a focus of the community as we were building the community land trust. And even with the ability to work with the CDC at the time, we still felt that the community land trust was needed. And that need was not just in Boyle Heights and East LA, but as you can see, there was, as we were getting started, there was 3 other community land trusts getting started in LA County. So we had Liberty Community Land Trust. We had El Sereno Community Land Trust, which they're a neighbor of ours. Like it's literally a mile away from where we're at, and there's a community land trust there. And then and then it was us. But existing COTs were Trust South LA and the Beverly, Vermont Community Land Trust, which are the two oldest community land trusts in LA. And so this is kind of like the geography of our COT coverage, so folks could see. And so the COT coalition was actually formed literally like a month or two before the pandemic. And it was during the first California COT Network conference where we actually learned about each other, we talked to each other. And one of the things that we said is like, we really need to build capacity for each other, and that we can't be working isolated in our neighborhoods. And so we formed the community, the Los Angeles Community Land Trust Coalition. And one of the most beautiful things about this coalition is that it's not just a coalition where we meet, it's a coalition where we share resources, where we build capacity, where we fundraise. And so in the last 2 years, we've fundraised $3 million to really start up the infrastructure of all 5 organizations in a way that allows us to do the work that we're set up to do. What is this? And for us, because we were formed during the pandemic, it was always a priority to make sure that any recovery that was going to happen in LA County really took into consideration that we were already in a housing crisis before, that any funding that came in federally from the state or locally really needed to invest in the infrastructure that was needed to preserve people in their homes or keep people in their homes, and to build out a community ownership model for our neighborhoods. And so that kind of led to having 2 really important pilot programs that we're working on right now. One of them is the Chapter 8 Foreclosure pilot program, in where the county has invested $1 million for COTs to purchase foreclosed properties through tax foreclosure. This is a really long program. It's a really hard program to work. Not because, and mostly because we don't want anyone to be foreclosed on for tax foreclosure. And so it takes patience, and it's really around supporting landlords and supporting people from not being foreclosed on, and doing all the preventative and making sure folks get as many opportunities as they can to not be foreclosed on. But the second program is really kind of what really helped us grow and really nourish the partnerships that we have, and I'll talk more about it. But we got $14 million among 5 CLTs to acquire 5 properties, and it needed to be 50 units minimum. And we had a year to spend it. And so we're about to close we're about to spend all the money. And so at this point, we have 8 properties, which exceeds the 5, and we've have about 60 units of now permanently supportive housing, permanent affordable housing, specifically because they're now in control of a community land trust. And I'll talk about the structures that we use. But just some background, LA has always had a really great kind of ecosystem of CDCs, CDFIs, philanthropy, and the public sector working together. And so a couple of these bubbles represent some of the ways that CDFIs, CDCs, community-based organizations work together to collaborate. And so during the pandemic, these were some of the ecosystems that existed for us to be able to work together and ensure that funding actually was being used to stabilize our communities and to have a just recovery. And so let me look at this really quick. Yeah, so we have what's called the CDC Neighborhood Exchange, where community development corporations come together, talk about acquisition strategies, affordable housing strategies, and it's really just a place to kind of share and grow together. And I think there's like share funding around there. There's also what we call the Healthy LA coalition, and that coalition was formed during the pandemic, and it and at the peak of it, there was 300 organizations working together to really think about of a just recovery in LA, and how federal funding was going to be used and local funding was going to be used for direct services, for acquisitions, to just make sure that everything that we needed in the community was going to get done. And then we had the LA COT coalition. And so having this like really and then we had like philanthropy, we had like a financial partner, like financial institutions supporting us as well. And so that really created what we call the Acquisition Rehab Work Group, in where CDCs and community land trusts and financial institutions were coming together to figure out how we were going to acquire and preserve naturally affordable housing, specifically like small multifamily buildings. And so this is kind of like, for us, it's really important that this sort of build out, it's not just like the CDC COT partnership that needs to be built out, but you really have to think about your region, and you have to think about the infrastructures that exist or that need to be built out. And so this is kind of a little glimpse of like what LA has. And so for us, this is kind of like what the actual program looks like. And so for us, it's around forming the COT CDC partnership. It's around securing the funding for us to acquire buildings, and also working with each other to identify a pipeline. And that, we could we could have another session around community engagement and what it looks like and the organizing that takes, but that's really a core part of it. And then working within that structure that I just talked about to really work through the details of it, because it just doesn't take like one COT and a CD. You could have that, but it's always going to be better if there's like an actual work group of multiple organizations working through this together. And overall, the long-term success that we think of this is that community land trusts and tenants having control and ownership of the acquisitions and the preservation that we're working on. So overall, that's like a really core goal that we have in terms of thinking of that. And so just to close off and maybe turn it over to Debbie, is that when we were thinking about these models, we didn't just work on one model. We worked on like how the acquisition models were gonna look like, but then we also worked through some examples of what the outcome would be. So for instance, Little Tokyo Service Center and Fideicomiso Comunitario, we're on a joint LLC. Little Tokyo Service Center manages the LLC, but at the same time, they're like mentoring, working with us to kind of learn the process of acquisition, learn the process of rehab. And it's really like a mentor relationship that we have and that we appreciate. But there's COTs that don't need that. There's COTs that have their own, acquire the structure, acquire the land, and work with the CDC to do some of the back-end work, to have some of the legitimacy that's needed to be able to do the work. And then there's other partnerships where the COT really needs more support, and the entire structure is owned by the CDC, and then eventually will be transferred over to the COT. And so there's just different models that we have, but then we're also thinking about what's going to be the outcome of that. So are Are we going to do a limited equity cooperative? And how are we going to work through that? Are we going to, is it just going to stay as a rental property? And how do we support the COT to make sure that they're able to manage the property, able to maintain the property in perpetuity? And so for us, there's just a couple like scenarios that we have, and we could go over them later, but this is kind of a glimpse of the different models that we use in thinking about the COT CDC partnership. And so I'll pass it over to Debbie just to talk more about our acquisition.
Thanks, Roberto. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for being here this afternoon. You're our, the closing plenary just happened? Yeah? Okay, well, you're our skeleton crew, so thank you for coming out today. And Roberto, you were saying earlier that, there are many different ways and shapes that a CLT and CDC partnership can operate. And I think for us at LTSC, it's always been critical to our mission to uplift communities of color, BIPOC communities. I think even before we started working together, I think our paths have crossed. LTSC has a portfolio of about 1,000 units of affordable housing, and the majority of these projects were developed in partnership with other community organizations. So about 24 community different organizations and partnerships, that have culminated in our body of work today. Community land trusts are very fascinating. I think that we do see our work as a community development corporation, as a 40-year-old organization with this experience in affordable housing and development of community assets. I think it's really been a capacity building a joint venture for so many, for so much of the way. And, Roberto, what you want to do with that information and that experience is up to you. Like Leo said, there are so many ways, shapes, and forms that a community land trust can work. That's why it's so fascinating. It's so versatile, and that makes it more effective. But just to give you a little glimpse of what we have been up to, so you were asking lots of questions about what type of ownership model we want to embark on down the road, and I'm going to do my best to answer them because I think we did. So we're co-owners right now. We have a 50-50 stake in a property that we acquired last year in May of 2021. The plan, is we're here together for the next few years, and we're going to figure out, A, acquire the property, check. B, how to rehab the property, which it's quite a lot of work when you acquire NOAA properties in this situation. Not that you can't, look at how this could apply to expiring use. I think that's something we're very interested in as properties come across their, 30-year covenant expiration dates, or even further out. But for us, I think we do want to see a transfer of our ownership stake in a couple years' time fully to the community land trust. At that point in time, simultaneously, there would be a split between the land and the improvements. So the land trust would hang on to the land, and this is a process we're going through with a lot of the residents. The plan is to create a limited equity co-op, and for there to be a fractional ownership model for the structure. LTSC, we've done our work. You know what to do from start to finish, and that's a success. So just so you know, this is what we plan to do with this building right here. The property that we acquired is 700 Simmons Avenue. It's 11 unit, 2-building structure in East Los Angeles. There are currently 10 tenants living in the property. On average, more than half of the tenants have lived here for a decade. Some double or triple than that. This building's been around since the 1930s. We acquired it for just a hair below $2 million. We have additional funding for a total of $2.8 million, so that helps us to cover the rehab. This was a grant funding from the Los Angeles County Development Authority, it's coming in about $250,000 per unit, all in, for acquisition and rehab. In addition, we do want to point to the early stage capital that came in through Spark and Genesis, which is a local Los Angeles-based community development financial institution. There were several qualifying criteria that we considered for the property. It's funny, we actually looked at least 3 or 4 properties when we were searching for sites together, and we looked at some properties that they were about to go on the market, and within a week of us identifying them, it turned out they had gone under contract. There was a whole landscape of real estate speculators and investors in the area, especially during these past few years, and that coupled with the amount of people who had been furloughed or lost their jobs, who were kind of living on the cusp of homelessness, helped to spark some additional urgency for this program with the county, and on our parts, the county heard from us in all different channels. So, you can see some of the criteria help to shape, right, what we were looking for in a site as well. And that's really how we landed where we did. So, I think that for us, this has been a very grassroots effort. We are a 40-year-old community development corporation based in Little Tokyo, which is not so far from the neighborhoods of Boyle Heights and in East LA, where Roberto's Community Land Trust works and lives and plays. So it's really been, like I said, a grassroots effort. We've spoken so much with the county, and also want to mention Enterprise, which was a group that helped us assemble the acquisition rehab working group, and to really amplify, right, the need for this program. But I think the way we worked as a model, there's this partnership that's based on a common mission, a lot of alignment in the type of work, and just the reality of people's lives and those around us most closely. So I think that when we decided to work together, that was a big factor of why we were keen to partner. But and I just want to emphasize the human element of it very much. But also, I think these agencies and the enterprises and Genesis of the world, they were there to really listen to the communities, these Black and brown, other people of color, and these communities, and for us to tell them, no, this is how you can also help to solve some of the economic impacts or address the economic impacts of COVID and of rising homelessness. And we're there, we'll get it done. It's only been a year and a half. We have 60 units and 8 projects under our belt. And I think that this model has so far, while been a pilot, been successful to move relatively fast. And just a quick note, we are really in the thick of a rehab. Last thing about these NOAA properties, they can be very old, lots of deferred maintenance, so capital does remain a challenge. Having access to fast and flexible capital does go a long way, but I think also looking at the type of loan products that could be available to help us work through these type of larger scale renovations. You know, we come in at $250,000 per unit in terms of this public subsidy, and that is always more, I think for the most part, preservation is more cost effective in terms of keeping units, affordable units available and online. But, you know, just want to put a plug out there if there's anybody to think about the type of challenges with these properties in particular around the financing. That's all I have to say about this particular case. I'm going to turn it over to Stacy and Jeremy. Thanks.
And let's give it up for Debbie and Roberto. I think it's cool to see how you saw this partnership both as a way to, you know, do this particular project with this particular property, but also as a capacity building exercise to build up the community land trust capacity to do future projects. So that's pretty exciting. So let's travel across the state to Marin, and we'll hear from Stacy and Jeremy about their project.
Okay, I'm going to use this mic because we're talking intermittently. I hope that connects through. Hi, everyone. My name is Stacy Lauman, and I work with the Community Land Trust Association of West Marin, fondly known as CLAM. So we love our name. I want to tell you a little bit about just who CLAM is and where we're located, and then just a bit about the project, and then Jeremy and I are going to share slides about a very specific project that we're working together in partnership on. So CLAM is a community-based land trust in West Marin. West Marin is about 25 miles north of San Francisco. It's very rural. We have economy based on dairy agriculture and visitor serving activities. The Point Reyes National Seashore is a budding Point Reyes station, so it brings in over 1 million visitors each year. So a lot of the economy and the jobs and the activities that you find and the folks that work in West Marin are supporting those two industries, which are both low-income industries. But we also have a lot of people that own second homes in West Marin. It's a gorgeous place to live, and lots of people want to be there. And so that creates a really significant pressure on the cost of housing. We're also in the coastal zone, so that creates some difficulties and challenges in terms of density and creating land. And finally, because of the agricultural setting and the open space, there is over 80% of Marin County's land is preserved for open space or agriculture. So the available land for development and the density associated with that available land is very low. So with that, that's sort of the context that we're working in West Marin. And then I just want to say that the Coast Guard project is the largest project. It'll be 51 units of housing, and that is the largest multifamily project in West Marin. It's significant for us, even though it's not very large in terms of the scale that others may be working in urban settings.
Just by way of introduction, Jeremy Hoffman, Associate Director of Real Estate Development with Eden. Eden is a nonprofit developer that's been around for more than 50 years. We own and manage about 10,000 units of housing. And similar to Little Tokyo, it's a part of our mission to work with CDCs and CLTs and to help build capacity. So that's the backdrop for our partnership with CLAM on this project. And as Stacy mentioned, the former Coast Guard housing base is going to have 51 units. There's 36 existing townhomes that are going to be rehabbed, and a barracks building, or former barracks building, that we're going to be adapting into one-bedroom apartments. There's also a kind of administrative building that exists that is going to be adapted into the kind of community center, property management offices, resident services. offices, and so that is what comprises the housing project. We're also going to be developing a new wastewater treatment facility, and because this is rural West Marin, there's no central sewer system. Historically, the Coast Guard actually collected all of the waste into storage tanks and then had a truck come and pump it out and take it off-site for disposal, which is not particularly sustainable. And so as a part of the RFP process, and I guess maybe taking even a bigger step back, I think it was 5 years ago, the Coast Guard stopped using the property. CLAM and other community members lobbied their local congressperson to on the federal level to pass legislation to allow for the county to acquire the property instead of it going on the auction, and by that way to preserve it for affordable housing. So in 2019, the county acquired the property. Is that right?
That's right. I can talk a little bit about
Okay,
that.
great.
So, yeah, the property was decommissioned by the Coast Guard in 2014. And just a bit of context, at that time, community members heard, like, oh, wow, this property is being, you know, what's going to happen to it? It's going to go on the GSA general auction block, and we can't have this property go for, you know, for-profit developers. That would just be just awful for the community. So people organized, and they talked with Jared Hoffman, they talked with our local county supervisor, and we worked to go all the way up to the federal level to have federal legislation passed so that this property in particular would be taken out of the GSA process, and that written into the Coast Guard legislation now, this property had to be sold to the County of Marin for the express purpose of affordable housing and community benefit. It was a huge win, and it was all due to the community organizing that had gone through my organization and the community members there, so it was really exciting. I have to mention that in Contra Costa, there is another Coast Guard site that was recently decommissioned around the same time. They took a different process, and unfortunately that was sold this past year to a for-profit developer. So this is the map of our property, so you can see it's a really large piece of property, very rural. It's 32 acres in total. And so in terms of our partnership, we're working on providing 51 units of affordable housing, and that's all represented in the blue buildings there. There are 10 attached townhomes and then an apartment building. And then we also want to see some community benefit there. And so we're taking the pink buildings there and looking to develop with partners in the community assets that would be something like an educational center. So we may partner with the library or the community center, the senior center, the community services center, or combine all of those things to bring some of the service aspects that nonprofits provide in the community into a more central location and offer more services for people not only that live here on the property, but folks to come into the property as well.
And in the bottom left of the slide, you can see where the wastewater treatment facility will be sited. And one aspect of it that we're really excited about is that we're going to be treating the water to essentially be recycled water, and we're going to use it for irrigating all the landscaping on the site. So we're really, really excited about that component of the project.
Yeah, so in terms of project goals, when the project was decommissioned, our organization and the community came together and thought really deeply about what do we want to see here. And it was really clear that we wanted to maximize the benefit of affordable housing on site. Given the condition of the site, we knew that it needed to be significantly rehabbed, although we didn't know to what degree until we got into partnership with Eden. But we knew we wanted to use the existing structures and not build more in the community because of there's a lot of environmental constraints here. We knew that we wanted to have an intergenerational community. We knew that we wanted to connect this neighborhood to town and have people come in and people go out and have a fluidity as opposed to having a very separated housing project off to the side. Because it's abutting Lagunitas Creek, which is a really significant natural resource, we wanted to make sure that we valued and uplifted that resource and made that more available to people In the past, this property was closed to the public for many years. It was a Homeland Security site over the last 10 years. So we wanted to make sure that the public can have access to this space. We also know that being built in 1972, the environmental standards here were probably pretty outdated, so we wanted to make sure that we could really improve this place and potentially achieve net zero energy, or zero net energy. And then lastly, as a community land trust, we knew that we wanted to steward the land into the future. It was really important, it is very important, that we make sure that we control the land so that as things change, as the community evolves, we as a community organization can understand the needs of community and potentially bring new, changing, additional things forward over the years to come.
So the county had selected Clam and Eden's proposal in early 2020. So right now we're in, still in fairly early pre-development. We're this summer going to be submitting our planning application for entitlements, and also because it's such a unique project and site for us with the wastewater treatment facility, with converting all the buildings to all electric, really dedicating to pursuing zero net energy around solar. It's a very expensive project. And so at this point, our financing strategy is going to involve 4% tax credits and tax exempt bonds. We've already gotten a couple allocations of county funding, but we'll continue to pursue more. We've also received some philanthropic funding from the Marin Community Foundation, and we'll continue to pursue more. And we'll be applying for project-based Section 8 vouchers, and also potentially we'll be pursuing HCD funding programs, although we're still kind of figuring out what's going to make the most sense for the project. The affordability is going to range from 30 to 60% of AMI. There's the PVV units will overlay onto formerly homeless units. And as I mentioned previously, the barracks buildings can be converted into 15 one-bedroom apartments that will be serving seniors, and there'll be an elevator added to that building. The townhomes will serve larger families, and a portion of them will have a preference for agricultural workers, and 10% of all the units will be ADA mobility accessible.
I just want to add to that what Jeremy just mentioned is focusing on the housing project, but then we have this side project too, which is the community benefit project. So we're working together on the site plan, and then it's sort of a bifurcated track where we're submitting the planning application and we're conceptualizing the project together, but then there are going to be two financing streams, one for the housing and then one for the community benefit, which may move forward at the same time in construction, but we may peel that community benefit portion off at a later time as well. So that's something that we're working through together, where we're relying on sort of Clam's vision and connection with the community to determine what that will be, but also relying on Eden's experience on figuring out how can that work and what's the best option, and we're using the same architect and the same development team at the same time to move the whole project forward. So it's an interesting component, I think.
And on the site plan, you can see that we're going to be subdividing the 32-acre site into two parcels. One that is the housing parcel, which is fairly tight to the road and the housing buildings, and then the second parcel that will be owned solely by Clam is really all the open space as well as the community buildings. So just one note there in terms of structure.
Yeah, so why did Clam want to partner with a developer? And I think, to me, it's very clear that, as Leo had said before, we have complementary strengths as organizations, so it's really useful for us to be working together. And from our perspective, Clam, in this very rural setting, we have single-family homes that have ADUs and JDUs. We have a 4-unit apartment building. We have an 8-unit apartment building. We've never taken on anything of this capacity and magnitude before. So this is something that we really feel like we needed a lot of expertise and knowledge about, just in conceiving of and managing this kind of beast of a project. And then there's the technical aspects. Like, we really needed someone that has a lot of development experience so we could figure out how to move our way through this complicated acquisition rehab. And we also needed access to funds on a scale that could support this, and also, you know, figure out how we could attract tax credits. And I have to mention on that, there are a lot of ways to fund a project, but the County of Marin that was holding the property and providing opportunity to developers, we had a competitive bidding process. It was clear through their request for proposals that they were looking for a development team that would take a traditional rental project approach. And so we knew that we needed to find a partner that could be flexible with CLAM to understand our local context and needs, be a really good partner, but also provide all of those very traditional rental project capacities that we would be looking for in order to win the bid in the first place.
And from Eden's perspective, we have done work in Marin County, but not in West Marin previously. And so when we were looking at the RFP, partnering with CLAM, who is boots on the ground and embedded within the community and really represents the community, really made a lot of sense, in addition to being in line with Eden's mission of working with CDCs and CLTs to help them to build capacity. So we were really excited that CLAM selected us to be their partner, because we know that they had other options. And so it's really worked into a great partnership in as far as the last year and a half of working together. So we can talk a little bit about roles and responsibilities amongst us in our partnership, and also a little bit more about the structure.
So we're managing the project together. Jeremy and I sit weekly on hours of Zoom calls together.
Many hours.
But we bring our strengths to that. So obviously, you know, as a community-based organization, I'm responsibility for things like marshaling community support, connecting with community organizations to make sure they understand what we're doing and how we can support them. Where I'm responsible for working with the communications in our area to make sure that employers and other folks, people when they're have questions on Nextdoor, that we're managing the messaging around the project and maintaining a really, really high level of community support, which we've thankfully enjoyed throughout the process. And then, of course, we're directing and trying to work through defining the community asset portion of the project. And Jeremy, do you want to talk about the things that Eden's bringing?
Yeah, and so Eden is using our own funding, as well as some financing that we've secured for pre-development, and we're also in charge of bringing our experience around structuring affordable housing and tax credit deals. So we're taking lead on that. We are also then taking point on securing all of that financing. We're point on coordinating design and construction, and also we'll be long-term we'll be managing the property, so we'll be doing the lease up and marketing. But for all of these things, we're really, Stacy's in every conversation, on every call, and so again, we're really trying to build CLAM's knowledge and skill sets on the next one that they can go out and do it themselves.
Also, I just thought of something that we didn't talk about, Jeremy, before, but I have relationships with people in the planning department or the county supervisor or the folks in the housing department, and Eden does too, but I think the relationship is slightly different sometimes. So I think we've been able to leverage those relationships, even though they may be with similar people, but in different ways to really support the project and make sure that we have a high level of support at the regulatory level and at the political level. And then also we have similar relationships with some of our funders. So with Marin Community Foundation, for example, my organization has a strong relationship with Marin Community Foundation, but so does Eden. So when we come to them talking about this kind of project, I think there's a really high level of confidence because they know not one but two partners and understand how we both do our work and how we plan to bring this project forward. So I think at the regulatory level, and at the personal level with funders, et cetera, it's important, and it's been useful to have both of us sharing capacity.
Totally agree. And just a little bit more detail about our structure. We're essentially 50-50 partners. CLAM's co-GP. Eden and CLAM are going to be splitting developer fee and cash flow. And Eden, as I mentioned before, is funding pre-development costs and will be reimbursed at closing. And then as far as ongoing operations and management, Eden will be the asset manager and property manager through year 15. CLAM will provide the resident services, and CLAM will have the right of first refusal at year 15. And at that point, if they feel like they have the organizational capacity to fully take over property management and ownership, then Eden will step out of the transaction at that point. And so the hope and the goal is that is what will come to pass. I think that's essentially it for us.
All right, let's give a round of applause to the Coast Guard crew. And this is probably a good moment to shake it out a little. So if you want to join me, a little wiggling of the arms, whatever you need. Yeah, some bending? Yeah, sure. Oh yeah, that one's good. The back crack. Right on. We're gonna need your good questions in a few minutes, so I hope you're brewing them up. And I hope that was as interesting for you as it was for me to hear about two projects in pretty radically different contexts, given that they're both in the state, different types of projects from the point of view of the property itself and what you're trying to do with the property, obviously different cultural, demographic contexts, and utilizing different financing sources. So that's really great. I think that my first set of questions may have been sufficiently answered. I'm going to ask it anyway just to see if we want to add anything. And it was the kind of dating game style question. What do CLTs look for in a development partner? And then what would developers be, or why would developers be interested in partnering with the CLT? I think we've heard a lot of good answers already, but if there's anything you want to add, and then we'll move on to juicier questions.
Yeah, I think in LA, I think there's very few developers who wanted to work with CLTs, but there were options, and I think Little Tokyo Service Center made a lot of sense, specifically around the racial history of living in a segregated area of LA. And specifically, like the Japanese community and the Mexican community and the Jewish community, like coexisting for hundreds of years, and so for us, Little Tokyo Service Center has always been there as like a really strong pillar in terms of the resources, not only for Little Tokyo but for the surrounding neighborhoods. And so for us, it was a priority to ensure that our partnership was with Little Tokyo Service Center. One, in the resources that they have and the capacity that they have, but also just like that historical solidarity among like neighborhoods, and knowing that there is like trust there that was really around like ending a lot of the racial injustice and like building something that was going to repair. So for us, it was really key. Even though there were other developers who were willing and really willing to support us in the same way that Little Tokyo Service Center was. So I'll just add that.
So I want to ask about, if it was easy to take to your respective organizations and boards the idea of entering into one of these partnerships, or if there were apprehensions and challenges, I guess, in the past tense and present tense, that would be interesting for us to explore. Was everyone 100% on board all the way, or did people have to be talked into it, and why?
So LTSC has done a lot of partnerships, so I think it was, in some respects, just, another partnership, and we were familiar with that. On the other hand, how do we do affordable housing for the last 30 plus years, it's been low-income housing tax credits. And this was a slightly different model, at least in our case. The thing is, the landscape has changed, at least in California. Bonds are competitive. We don't necessarily have good methods of financing, especially for acquisition and rehab. And for developers that have been around a while, you have your aging portfolios. You're way past year 15, we were looking for alternatives to do AC rehab, working with the county and with some of these other financing institutions and with community land trusts. We're starting with the naturally occurring affordable housing properties, yes, but it's a model that can be applied to expiring use properties as well. So I think as we were watching in the past year and a half, that infrastructure that Roberto talked about falling into place, the players, the programs, and from there it really begets some of that capital. It creates that enabling environment to build the capacity. And we thought, what, the timing is right. The pieces are in place. We can make this work. So I think the conditions were just right. I don't want to say that it was all due to the pandemic, right? I don't want to say, but that and the pandemic has not been a good thing. But I think that circumstances that were already dire became more dire, and the urgency was undeniable. So I think that forced all of our hands, and it helped us create something new together.
Just from my community land trust perspective, Leo, you asked the question, was there any pushback or any concern on the part of boards? And I think from our CLT is super scrappy. We have done a lot of, we've acquired a project with very, very few institutional sources, a whole lot of donor buy-in, and, we've done things like on our own in really funky ways. And so bringing on a partner and doing like a project of this size with a lot of factors that we don't have control over felt and feels very, very scary. And I think that the core of a community land trust is community control. And so when we are entering into a partnership with investors, for example, that really feels like we're losing some control. And so part of my responsibility is to really figure out and carve out where are those places where the CLT has a stamp, where the community feels like they are in control, where the folks that will be living on this property will have a say and feel like they're invested. I think that's something that is a challenge for CLTs when we enter into investor relationship in particular. Less about our development partner, but more about where the money comes from and how we're managing the project finances.
And also the kind of regulations that come along with it. For example, CLAM would really like to see, and the community would really like to see, a daycare for young children at this site, but because of the tax credits in this location, it makes it not possible for that use to get tax credits. That means we'd have to fund it through other means. So just one example where regulations and around the financing approach have take away some of the optionality for the community to realize what they would really like to have. So just another note there.
And I think we got a good feel from on the Coast Guard project about this, but maybe with Roberto and Debbie, could you tell us a little about how you chose to split project responsibilities with the Simmons building?
Yeah, I would say we have a pretty clear split where Fideicomiso is the project lead on a lot of the services that are provided to the residents. You know, right now going through relocation, Fideicomiso is really working closely, and you know, I think you do find when you work with residents that are in very vulnerable situations at this point in time, that there's supportive services involved, beyond just your run-of-the-mill resident programming. So Fideicomiso has really stepped up in that regard. Prior to the acquisition, when we were looking for sites, we really followed the direction of Fideicomiso as well. What were the criteria, right, to identify sites on the market, and just being able to take that and run with it, which really worked out well. And we were the closer. We did the acquisition, and we've really been coordinating between the architect, the permitting process, the general contractor throughout this rehab. For asset management and property management, I think LTSC does have that infrastructure in place to do some of that work in-house. So we have, we often do contract out third party for our bigger multifamily, but we've done this in-house, and I think a good result of that is there's been some mentorship that's been able to come out. We worked on the income certifications at the end of last year together, and like really we see this as even though one of us is the lead on one thing and the other the lead on some other thing, we really do see this as meeting every single week, running through the items as a capacity building exercise as well.
Okay, so for the folks online, please feel free to submit questions. I think I can see them here. I think there's 85 of you. We have 5 likes. We could probably get some more likes going, for whatever that's worth. And let's open it up to questions from everyone here as well. I have a microphone. I think there might be another portable microphone in the back. So I'll run it over, and I see a question there. And please introduce yourself and your organization before asking your question.
I'm Linda Wheaton from SCAG. To your question, Roberto, the slide that you had that showed something like 330 CBOs or whatever, I think, that you looked at the overlapping circles of interest. And your comment about the reticence for a number of organizations to actually engage in a CLT. How do we scale it up? I mean, especially in LA. It's great, but the reality is we're still looking at very small scale development, and we have such huge needs. So what more support do you need for helping to scale it up?
Yeah, I think that the circles of the kind of existing structures that kind of come and meet, and that meeting is the acquisition rehab work group, where CDCs and community land trusts meet weekly, or is it weekly? Yeah, it is weekly on Fridays, and on Friday of all days, right? When you want to go home and not do anything. It's really great to see that, that space is not just like a capacity building space for the current programs that we're working on or the current developments that we're working on. It's also a space of thinking long term. And it's a place where we are assessing and evaluating the work that we're doing as well, and seeing how the structures that we're building are setting our organizations up and other emerging CLTs to be able to take on these opportunities. And so in times of crisis, there were opportunities. And we had structures set up to be able to keep up and not be left behind in terms of like federal funding, state funding, and local funding that existed. And so this acquisition rehab group is really thinking of FIP. Today was like FIP was mentioned, right? And CAP. And so for us, we're thinking about these other funds that are coming in. LA is working on a ballot measure to tax sales of over 5 million property tax of properties being sold, and that's going to create a significant amount of income or cash flow into community-based organizations and CDCs and COTs. And so we're doing push-ups. We're working out on Fridays at this acquisition rehab work group, because we're set that when these sources of funding come into our neighborhood, Black and brown or BIPOC communities are going to be ready and are not going to be left behind in terms of making sure that we are making use of those funds. And so in a lot of ways, that's what we're doing. And so it's pretty tiring. It takes a lot of work. And there's like ongoing learning. And I think the California COT network is doing a really great job in terms of like building capacity building, or like, you know, I saw Lisk was here like at this conference, and Lisk is talking to us. The CDFIs are working with us to make sure that we're ready in terms of like financially ready. And so in a lot of ways, like these last 2 years have been really intense in the way we're thinking about community land trust infrastructure and CDC and COT infrastructure. And it's not just like taking advantage of this $14 million pilot program, but it's really thinking long term. And so in a lot of ways, like I can't give you exact numbers, but I could tell you that we're training really hard, or we're like building out really strong infrastructure where it's gonna like what we're doing now is gonna impact all these other policies that are gonna be hopefully implemented in the next 2 years.
And I think that's already happening. You know, the $500 million foreclosure intervention, homelessness prevention program that will be, you know, coming out of, you know, the State of California Housing Community Development Department in the summer. You know, a lot of that model is being inspired by the LA County Community Land Trusts and Partnerships pilot program. And, you know, there's been a lot of listening sessions, a lot of I think, flexibility and agency that's being given on the local level. That's you know, it's very much model after what we've done. So hopefully the 500 billion helps to scale things up too. It's not so shabby, right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And the CLT network did a survey of our members over the summer. And among other things, we're trying to get a feel for, you know, what they saw as the biggest obstacles to reaching scale and achieving their goals. And the number one by far thing that was noted was acquisition funding, right? So that's what we're talking about. The FIP program that was passed. Roberto just mentioned the CAP program. That's the one being put forward by Assemblymember Bloom. Support letters are welcome, and if you are interested in writing one, you can find me after the panel. And then there's a bunch of local funding measures like the ballot measure in LA and other local pushes as well. Other questions?
Thank you. I guess for the Marin project, can you talk me through tenant selection and how that's going to work with a CLA or CLT overlay when Eden's doing the lease up, and also to the LA project again with the existing tenants and how that's all worked out, and if you're able to certify before close on the property and what that experience has been like.
So just quickly for the Coast Guard project, we will have a affirmative fair housing marketing plan. We'll follow the lottery procedures that we commit to with the county. So that has been one I think challenge for I don't want to speak for CLAM, but just that they do have an existing wait list and that can't be used. They can of course do outreach to all of their members and their community and encourage people to apply, but ultimately it's going to have to go through a lottery process. I'm sorry? Run by the county? No, it's run by us, but per the county requirements around selection and point scoring and things like that.
I just say that's been a really touchy point for the community because people, we're like 30, 40, 45 minutes easy from the nearest very small employment center. So, it's really important that local workforce not be pushed out of the area. That's part of our mission to avoid and eliminate displacement that's happening throughout. So when we talk at the local level around, this project is coming, people want to get in line right away. So we've had a really delicate time of talking with people about how we have to abide by fair housing laws. At the same time, we as a community-based organization are going to make sure that people are financially ready. So we'll have financial education in advance, that people form households, that they understand the household sizes and the demand or the type of units that we're going to provide, so people know when to apply, that they will have support from us to apply locally, and while we're broadly marketing and doing everything we can to be as welcoming and inclusive in the process as possible.
Can you just repeat the LA part of the question?
Oh yeah, I guess just acquiring a property with existing tenants, what that experience has been like with the Community Land Trust overlay, and then how you get tenants to certify before or after close, and how that's all gone for you.
Yeah, it's actually been a really cool process. So prior to acquiring the buildings, the advocacy for this pilot program has been really awesome, and shout outs to the Healthy LA Coalition, which is over 300 organizations in LA that were really kind of thinking about federal funding coming in and how we were going to use it. And we were actually advocating for ARPA and CARES Act. We were advocating for all this funding to be used for acquisitions. None of it worked out, but we were so good and so good at convincing our local elected officials of how important the things that we were proposing were, that they used $14 million of the Affordable Housing Trust Fund on the county for us to acquire buildings. At the same time that advocacy was happening, community land trusts and community-based organizations were on the ground, persistently knocking on doors, specifically knowing how pervasive the market was, to making sure that these tenants knew their tenant rights, and for folks not to be evicted. This is pre-ERAP. So we were just concerned that folks were gonna be evicted because of the different health conditions and economic conditions that they were in. And so that created a really good way to have a pipeline and an understanding of what buildings were being sold. And so prior to us even going into escrow or making a bid on the Simmons building, the Fideicomiso and another organization, Community Power Collective, we had already done outreach in the building. We had already done food distribution at the building. We had engaged the tenants around their rights and got a sense of what was happening in the building, and were able to identify that building and prioritize that building and many other buildings, which we could tell you all the horror stories of how those buildings were being flipped or being sold at such a rapid pace. And so by the time we did the income certification, we acquired the building in May. The first picture that I have where I introduced Fideicomiso is our first tenant meeting with the tenants. 100% of the tenants came out. All 10 families attended the meeting and have been pretty consistent every month of the monthly meetings we have. So from May to November, where we started doing the income certification, we had already built a relationship with the tenants. We had kind of talked about the purposes, done community land trust education work, and started working on prioritizing the immediate repairs that they needed just to live. And that's hard because we inherited a building with the tenants that is in dire need of repairs, and the substandard conditions that they live in is horrifying. I mean, we have homeless families living outside the building that were prior tenants of the building. That's how bad it is. And so for us, that relationship building and that trust building with the tenants is really a core part of the work that we do in terms of what our responsibility as a community land trust is in terms of this partnership. And Little Tokyo Service Center has been really great at granting us and working with us of us having that autonomy as an as a community land trust and being part of it and working with us on a daily basis.
Thank you, Roberto. But just also, this was a brand new county program, and we were helping to write the program, and that includes working through, this brand new grant agreement. And I think it wasn't just us, but it was also the county that was in new territory. So when we helped to, and the LA County Development Authority, LACTA, as well as especially Supervisor Solis. She was our county supervisor and really championed this program. We were working through the language, and I think it was very apparent. We were going to grandfather in a lot of the all of the tenants. And writing out the language for future tenants and what those income restrictions would look like, both during the rental phase as well as into the fractional ownership phase down the line. So we really thought through how that would work out. We do have income certifications that happen once a year after, but leading up to closing, well, thanks to Fideicomiso, we had a good sense of who was in the building, and that helped inform our site selection as well. And grandfathered the tenants.
Thanks, Debbie and Roberto. More questions? Anything in the back? Questions in the back? Okay.
How's it going? Name's Miguel Arambula. Work at Self-Help Enterprises, but also started a new community land trust in Fresno. Probably about 6 months old. Just had a question kind of about the MOU process, wondering if it's relatively short, and there obviously seems like a great relationship and a lot of trust, but it also seems maybe hard to quantify the nature and extent of the kind of partnership. So just kind of curious if you could give some advice for people who might be having an own MOU coming up here soon.
So I think, up front, having that relationship is going to make your life a lot easier down the line. And again, LTSE has done more than 24 partnerships at this point. And so we do have a template, right, for an MOU. And, there's certainly been certain, points where we know you really have to talk about it. But, a lot of that kind of, issues you can also stave off as early as possible by choosing your partner. I don't think that's perhaps the advice you're looking for, but I think that is honestly the most effective piece of advice from the get-go. And MOU is not very long. It gets straight to the point. Who does what? Who gets, who leads what? Who gets to provide feedback? Who co-decides? These are all laid out. We have almost a matrix to do that. I think it's just making sure you catch everything, and that's very hard to do, and it's hard to plan for every contingency, but that's the bulk of our MOU.
And I think in terms of quantify, I think labor does cost, and I'm always worried around oh shit, until when can Little Tokyo hold this? But I think one really cool thing about this specific pilot program, and in terms of designing the program that we're engaged in, is that we were able to add a developer fee and a capacity building fee in the acquisition. For the land trust and for the CDC, and that's how much power we had in designing the pilot program, and so I think that really helped in making sure that the roles that we both said we were going to do, at least we had something to cover it. It's not much, but it makes, in terms of when you say how do you quantify labor, I was really happy that Little Tokyo service was going to be taken care of. So I think that's just like what I wanted to add to. Yeah.
When we were looking for a partner, we actually wrote a request for proposals from partners. So that helped us understand what we were looking for in a partner. And then we saw from the folks that responded to that, the different ways that different developers were offering their capacity in collaboration with us. So by the time we got to an MOU with Eden, it actually was pretty simple because we already knew what we were looking for. We knew what their capacity was. And Eden had also done different MOUs. So we kind of picked from the common pieces that came through our RFP process.
I think we have time for one last question. One more? Oh, okay, how about this? I'm gonna take 2 quick questions and then we can answer them in bulk.
Hi, so the building that I live in is on a land trust. And I'm very interested in either contributing or participating or something. So I have lived experience in homelessness. I'm connected to a whole group of people who need housing, and this is very beneficial. And I just wanted to say that I'm in LA, so I'm gonna be hitting up all of you. Thank you.
Nice.
Great, thank you.
Hi, great panel. I'm Elizabeth Quata from Mercy Housing. I'm wondering if you could speak a bit more about the challenges or issues of using traditional affordable housing financing like LIHTC or HCD programs with CLTs.
Go for it. You want me to take it?
We don't do traditional financing.
Got it. So really, a joint venture with a CLT is no different than a joint venture with any CDC, with the caveat of if there's a ground lease in place, which oftentimes with CLTs there will be, that does have some implications around, not so much I think on the tax credit side, but around on the debt side. And that's really the only, I think, difference, because lenders are and LIHTC investors are comfortable with securing their loans to ground leases, both private and public. So that's not unique. But if the CLT, or at least this is we haven't actually closed our deal yet, but this is the guidance that our attorney's been giving me, is that if a CLT is both in the partnership structure, in like the LP that owns the leasehold interest, and they own the land, then it's a related party ground lease, which does mean that they'll require that the loan be secured both to the fee and to the leasehold interest. So that's, I think, important for both developers and CLTs to have open eyes going into that, be it, and I think, it doesn't really matter if it's LIHTC or not, but just that is the guidance that we're getting. And so some CLTs may, then it may change their perspective about what role they might have in the project if it means that, if there's a default on the housing project, that they could also lose the land. Whereas if they're not participating in the partnership, but just being the landowner and playing that stewardship role, then the loan would just be secured to the leasehold interest, and if there's a foreclosure, it would not impact the CLT. So that's really, the one, I think, important factor. I think everything else around applying for LIHTC and needing to have, around the experience to score all those points, et cetera, it's, no different than partnering with any other CDC.
And some of the things from the CLT perspective, we haven't borne out whether this is true or not, but some of our fears are, for example, like, many members of my board would like this to become a limited equity housing co-op in the future. So getting from here to there is possible with LIHTC as a front-end funding source, but it's a little more complicated potentially, right? So that's one thing, because we want people to have equity in the project if at all possible in the future. Another thing is, like, we as an organization have a renter equity program. So a percentage of a renter's rent goes into a fund every month, and then if they perform certain community service within the organization, then after 5 years, they get that equity back. So doing that through this kind of arrangement would just be more complicated. And then, you know, there's flexibility that we've given through the pandemic around if people couldn't pay their rent or if there's a significant change in their household size. We've been able to be really flexible with our renters because we have a small organization that can do that. But with a tax credit project, you know, it just ties one's hands more.
Cool. Let's give our panelists a big round of applause. Thank you all for coming out, and have a good day. Get home safe.